So, look, I just want to start by saying the kind of most generous thing I can say to the other side here, which is that I completely recognize that a lot of people on the left are trying to make the world a better place, and that they get involved with communism and Marxism, with positive intentions. And sorry, I was just going to say, very often when I'm dealing with conservatives or right wingers, I can't say that for them. Where it's like, look, what motivated you to get involved in politics? What are you trying to do? Like, it's not universal. I'd also say, I have a background dealing with Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist politics. A lot of those people do not have good intentions. So I can definitely say that when I'm dealing with the far left wing, I am very often dealing with people who have positive intentions and want to make the world a better place. However, I do think that, the legacy of Marxism, for example, is very fundamentally flawed and bad and wrong. And when I talk to younger people, sometimes older people, I'm now 42, but I sometimes talk to people in their 50s and 60s about this stuff, when they ask for advice about reading Marx or getting familiar with that, I don't tell them not to read this stuff or to slam the door on it, but I give them a lot of caution. Like, look, if this is the research you're going to be doing, here are the issues you're going to be encountering. Here's the type of dishonesty and misleading material written into the text. About a year and a half ago, my girlfriend got interested in studying Karl Marx and his legacy. And we did that. It was like a university course. I gave her this whole background on it. And we started going through Communist Manifesto and Des Capital and talking about its place in history. So, my position or my perspective relative to that history is not of a kind of ignorant outsider throwing stones at it. I'm someone who appreciates the good and the bad of it, but now in the year 2020, things being what they are, obviously what I have to say about it is a lot more cautionary than encouraging. So, a lot of things are like that. But again, that first concession I made is not insignificant. Most people who get involved with this, they do have some kind of good intentions, which is worth remembering.
Yeah, and I would probably posit the opposite side as well. To be fair on you, there is also people who have not only just have bad intentions and are power hungry, Stalinist kind of state communists, looking to take what they can from others. But then there's also the people who are even well intentioned, but they are so misled down this kind of vanguard thinking that they dismiss the rationality of others around them and seek to overthrow this invisible enemy, this ideological threat that is capitalism, and that it goes to their heads, and then ultimately they become these despotic, kind of cruel, evil human beings without even realizing it, because capitalism has tainted everyone else. They've become so ideologically embedded within this sort of dogmatic view that they become nasty, horrible human beings without even realizing it. And I do appreciate that. And I think that the horrors of the 20th century have taught us that, being, the road to hell can be paved with good intentions. It's I have no doubt that in many cases, take Lenin's philosophy, in many ways he was an idealist, hoping for this upper stage communist environment, which is very much like Star Trek or something. One second. Sorry, someone's talking. Essentially, he was an idealist in that respect, but ultimately, the regime that he propagated was cruel and unusual. It was wrong, especially when you see what Stalinism went and did.
Right. So look, I think there's a really good segue there. So what I was wanting to ask you, correct me wrong, but I believe you just identify as a socialist. You don't describe yourself as a communist, right? You're in a kind of intermediate position or middle position.
Socialist, anarcho-socialist.
Okay. So, right. So, the question I was going to put to you is about democracy in a pragmatic sense, because I think it puts these other issues into a useful, it calibrates all these other issues we're talking about. Now, Lenin is a guy who lost an election. They had elections in 1917 in Russia, and he lost. And he decided to hunt down and murder all of the members of the winning parties and all the members of parliament. Right, so that's what's called the Russian Civil War period. Now, you've just said some positive things about Lenin, and I'm not saying this to insult you. It's quite possible you've never read about that history. That's not the most
the white counter-revolution and so on.
Okay, right. But very fundamentally, when you talk about democracy, like I could ask you, well, do you think the people who won the election should have formed the government instead of Lenin? And I'll let you know, the party that won the election, they were called the Socialist Revolutionary Party. So they were far to the left, but they were not as insane as the Bolsheviks. So if they'd have been allowed to rule, they would have had a democratic but very left-wing government in power, probably a government you would have more in common with than you have in common with Lenin or Stalin. So this puts it in a very pragmatic context. Like, what does democracy mean to you, and what does socialism, what does communism mean to you?
I would say that democracy means everything to me. That would be like why I would. Do you know Richard Wolff? He's quite a popular figure in like socialism at the minute. And what he points socialism to be, and again the way that he's like, we've learned from our mistakes, and we've learned from the problems of the last century. And what we talk about is the democratization of the workplace as well as the political environment. And that's where I would say that I rely upon it.
But let's keep this kind of tangible in its simplicity. If you value democracy, as you just said, then morally and politically, you must oppose Lenin and what Lenin did. Like, you must look back on the history with horror, right?
I think, Lenin's repulsive.
Okay, good. Because you gave a relatively positive statement about Lenin before, which I wouldn't do. I wouldn't say anything positive about Lenin.
Oh, well, I think that you've got to like take Lenin like as what Lenin was, and I do think that he's like again, like I say, I do not agree with. I don't even agree with revolutionary politics. I do not see revolution as a way of taking control and power of a state. I see it as repugnant. But what I do is think about Lenin's writing and like Trotsky's writing is like their overall arcing goals, and what they wanted was idealistic, and what they wanted to do, what they saw as like impeding, obviously, this overall, like what they saw as like the best state for the individual was obviously capitalism, and they were seeking any way, shape or form of seizing power and opposing the capitalist regimes, which were causing issues within the 20th century. Right. And I think that, like, don't get me wrong, like I think Lenin was a bad guy, and I just think that his ideal, like his overall goal in terms of what he was never anywhere near, like his disgusting pragmatism of how he seized control and exercised power and authority ruthlessly against even his own people. It's repugnant, but his overall arcing like ends of his communism, quote unquote, were actually somewhat decent. They were never going to happen within the way he was approaching politics.
Okay, so I wouldn't agree with any of that, but the type of excuse you're making for Lenin now, I don't. But look, I mean, it is. You're really giving him a lot of positive. But I don't. Let me just suggest to you, it's a useful, pragmatic, real world comparison. I don't think you would make any of those excuses for the government of Japan from 1910 through to the end of World War II. And those excuses you've just made for Lenin, they're much more true of the government of Japan, to talk about it as an idealistic thing, what Japan was trying to do in that period. And of course, Japan was also much more successful. Japan did not produce the kind of unbelievable dystopia that Leninism produced. And Japan never, as repressive as Japanese fascism was, however you want to describe that regime, the ersatz mix of Japanese Shintoism and emperor worship, and they did have a parliament, they did have some democracy, by the way, in Japan in that period. Limited democracy, you might say, but no, they did. They kept electing the Diet, they kept having newspapers that had the freedom to criticize the government. There were many important features of democracy, you could say, even in the so-called fascist or authoritarian period in Japan. And I wouldn't make these kinds of excuses for Japan in that period either. But I'm pointing out, once you've adopted that excuse-making mentality of saying, and I understand you're being sincere, I appreciate your saying that you sympathize with the ideals and objectives of Lenin, and then you're willing to rationalize this other stuff in that context, well, it would make way more sense for you to be a Japanese fascist, both in reference to what happened historically, and in reference to what the present-day situation is. Right? The present-day result of what Lenin did is Vladimir Putin's regime in Russia, and you don't want to live there, right? And but it's a sincere argument. I mean, you may say that's a bad argument. I know you come out of a kind of textbook university philosophy background, but I mean, this is real life. Like, we have to make decisions. No, I'm sorry, but I mean this in a shallow real life sense of like, ultimately, you have to decide: would you rather live in Russia or Italy or Japan? Like, these are the kinds of shallow decisions that matter. The types of compromises you make, like, are you willing to come on the internet and say something positive about Lenin, or say something positive about the history of Japanese imperialism, those are like, they may be shallow, but that's the reality of how we live with politics, right? So I just say, it's partly shallow. Go on.
I wouldn't say, like, for example, like, it's like, I wouldn't defend, like, I'm not defending Lenin's, like, when I say, like, when I talk about Lenin's disgusting pragmatism, I mean his actions. I mean that the way that Lenin actually behaved, I think, was actually counter to the ideals that he seemed to profess within his writing, even, like, when he talked about, like, the end goal of communism. And a lot of that was stolen, obviously, from Marx, and like kind of propped up in like this kind of idealistic thinking. But then you've got, like, obviously, I was just telling the audience that I'm reading like Terrorism and Communism with Trotsky, and like the reality is that like people don't like to talk about how Trotsky was actually kind of a bad guy.
Right.
And,
Right.
like, okay,
Right.
like,
I understand, but why do you put yourself in this conflicted position? So, like, I think you would agree, like, it's not contentious in our culture in 2020, but it could be. I think you would agree that the Japanese imperial period had both good and bad, right? Now, we could digress into naming it off, right? Like, among other things, it was a period of modernization, and it produced Japan as we have today. And it was Japan being ruled by an elected government that there were elements of democracy and freedom of speech. So we've alluded to some of this, right? Like, it wasn't all bad, Japanese imperialism, and that's part of why Japan as it exists today is not all bad. So you could take a conflicted view of that and say, I see both the good and the bad in Japanese imperial history. Why? Why do this with Lenin, given what you've set up for me? Sorry, just to finish the parallels. Given what you said about Lenin and Leninism, why wouldn't your position just be, this is bad and wrong and regrettable? Like, why put yourself in a conflicted position?
I think exactly the same approach to even like forms of fascism and other like politically repugnant regimes. I would never want to mimic them, but I would say, like, you can, like, take for example Nazi Germany, as disgusting as it was, had a welfare state to some degree. I agree with the concept of a welfare state. I just don't agree with the gassing of the Jews. you know what I mean? And like, obviously, I'm not cherry picking parts of that state, because I would never want to replicate aspects of that state, because it was vile, disgusting, and obviously one of the greatest atrocities that I've ever faced humanity. And I would never be apologetic towards saying that, and even saying that about the USSR. I do think that the USSR was a disgusting regime in the first place. But then, even associating those regimes, like, we've got to remember that all of these regimes that we've even discussed so far have been totalitarian. And obviously, the type of socialist or communist that you talk to, they may not be totalitarian. So, for example, I'm an anarchist. I don't even believe in the kind of democracy that we have. I think the kind of democracy we have is shallow, and it's
You just said you approve of a social welfare state, though. But go on. I'm sorry, but you just said that. Go on.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah, I do believe. I think, like, for example, I think a real democratic anarcho state would actually be more close to what's.
So you want anarchy, but with a social welfare state? Okay, well, that's a pretty big contradiction of your thoughts. Okay.
Yeah, I know. I would say that could only happen if you had like an educated population willing to engage in mutual cooperation. And I think that's what real democracy and anarchy would look like. I think the real goal of like socialism, I think, like in its truest, most pure form, is almost it's a massive long shot away from what we even talk about today. It's about an educated population willing to engage within social cooperation for advantage of the everyday individual, and willing to genuinely help their fellow individual out of a state of ethical obligation. And I think that's what I think that most, as you say, like well-meaning, socialists going into it today are actually looking at socialism like that.
Okay, so look, I'm. It's not that I'm disregarding what you said, but I'm replying to something you said a whole 2 minutes ago or something. I think you are correct to raise the issue of cherry picking. But what I'm asking about really is the ethos or the ethic of cherry picking. You can cherry pick. Like, we can say, hey, during the Japanese imperial period, these are some things they did right. And maybe these are even things we can learn from today, or we could do in Canada, or Scotland, or wherever. Sorry, I know you're not from Scotland, you're from Northern England. But we could talk about Scotland as an exotic foreign country, both of us. I used to live in Scotland many years ago. Anyway, you can engage in cherry picking, but there are ethical questions involved, right? Now, so you raised the example of Nazi Germany, totally appropriate, I have no complaints, and then the comparison to Lenin and communism and so on. I think, what I'm pointing out to you is, why would you cherry pick Lenin this way? And then what does that say about you ethically? And what is your relationship, I can say on YouTube between you and your audience, but just in general in politics, between you and the people you're working with, if that's what you're willing to do. So, today, 2020, would you really tell the people of Cambodia that they should go back to communism? Or even in a more cherry-picking specific fashion, would you say to the people of Cambodia, hey, there are bits and pieces of Leninism that are still right and good and that you should go back and pick up? And see, I would not do that. I also would not today in 2020 say to the people of Germany that they can go back and cherry-pick Hitler and that there are positive aspects. But to give an example, you may not know this, Hitler was opposed to cigarette smoking, and he was especially opposed to women smoking cigarettes during pregnancy. He had a campaign to eliminate cigarette smoking. So, as absurd as it may sound, you can revive some isolated things of this, but I wouldn't do that. Even if Hitler is correct about smoking during pregnancy, if you go back and read what he said, it's insane racist shit. You could probably imagine it's about the decline of the race through cigarette smoking. It's really like. Even when he's right, he's wrong. Like, even when he's right about something, it's morally repugnant. Like, I really think there is a point in politics to saying, look, Lenin is a guy who hunted down and murdered the people who won the election. And I am fundamentally someone who's pro-democracy, so I am fundamentally someone who's anti-Leninism. Like, before we even get into Stalinism or Mao Zedong, at this stage, I can say, here are fundamental problems with communism, and even to some extent, fundamental problems with socialism, definitely fundamental problems with Marxism. I think, but I'm saying this because I think that's part of your own perspective, like, that you may not be entirely honest with yourself about. That's a necessary implication of some of your own values that you espouse.
Don't get me wrong, I think that, pretty much everything you've said, I agree with in many ways, I guess the real issue that I have is the conflation between, for example, Lenin's ideals and socialist ideals, or even communist ideals, right?
Totally reasonable point. That's a very chalkboard point, but it's a reasonable point. Go on.
Yeah, that's the thing. So, I think, for example, Lenin being anti-democracy, that is something that you would not find most socialists talking about today. Most socialists are going to be very much...
Right, but they're lying to themselves. But that's my point. That's the thing is, if you're honest with yourself, you have to reject Lenin for that reason, right? Go on.
What about socialism is anti-democracy?
Right. So look, it's a great question. We can return to that, but just to seemingly digress, but to me it's returning to the root of this. The decision we're making is not about the future of Canada or the future of England, right? The decision you and I are making right now is what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of person am I going to become, right? And I'm telling you, I am not someone who's going to compromise with Leninism or Stalinism. I'm not someone who's going to live my life making excuses for or rationalizing or relativizing what was wrong with communism. And I don't even do that with the Japanese Empire, 1910 to 1945 or something, whatever dates you want to use. Like, I don't even do that, which is a much less kind of horrifyingly one-sided, evil example. So, the point I'm raising here, yes, we can get into how exactly do you define, what's socialism and what's not. To what extent is Denmark a positive example? But we know, and I know, your whole YouTube channel would be different. Your interactions with the audience would be different. Your career in the future would be different after you finish this PhD. If you start describing yourself as someone who wants the future of England to look more like the present in Denmark, right? That's a totally moderate position. And if you're someone who says openly that you don't support, you don't compromise with Lenin or Stalin, you just agree with this, that's a completely different position, morally, aesthetically, and even pragmatically. And it's going to lead you into different things, as opposed to sitting around saying that you're an anarchist, but you still see value in the legacy of Lenin and Stalin and so on, right? Like, that's you are making a choice both about the kind of person you actually are and also how you present yourself to other people, how you work with other people. This has implications that frankly are philosophical in nature, given that you're a philosophy channel.
Oh yeah. I mean, absolutely. I would say that when we approach life, especially, the main decision that we do have to make is how we are going to live our lives. And I think that the ancient Greeks did a great job of educating us on that point in the first place. Most of Western philosophy has been about that, and ethics is a primary interest of mine. That's what I do. I'm a vegan, for that reason. The glorious vegan revolution.
Look, we're both vegan, so you can relate to this. It would be convenient for me to have an excuse-making mentality towards leather. Like, oh, well, if it's secondhand leather, or if I bought it before I became vegan, I can still use leather. That would be convenient. That would be expedient. right? But I don't do that because of this question of who do I want to be, and then also how do I interact with other people. I make the decision, no, I'm not going to compromise that. I'm going to have an uncompromising attitude towards rejecting leather. Like, I think you can see even within your own convictions, there is a reason for you to have an uncompromising attitude towards Leninism, socialism, and communism.
I do. I mean,
In that same way, even if it's not practical, like even if pragmatically it would be convenient to use secondhand leather, or it would be convenient to roll around like fucking Vaush and these other like pro-communist YouTubers and build up that audience and what have you, you know?
Fucking idiot, man. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I completely agree. Like, I tried calling the guy out myself. Like, the guy, like, he doesn't understand what I'm talking about. Like, don't get me wrong. I disagree with tankies all the time. Like, fucking pro-Leninist, Trotskyite, fucking nonsense that they come out with. Yeah, don't get me wrong. I completely disagree. But like, my main point is that, like, yes, absolutely. Like, we do have to choose who we are today. We do have to choose like how we are going to live our lives in the most ethical way possible. You know, I think even that, like, you know, Jordan Peterson, like, you know, take responsibility for yourself, tidy up your room kind of mentality. But I think like Slavoj Žižek does a great point in responding to that, and just says like, yeah, but what happens when somebody else is messing your room up? You know what I mean? And taking responsibility and like understanding your place within the world is understanding again like how our states should be formed and how we should obviously interact with one another politically. And if we accept that, then we have to understand that, okay, so looking back upon history, what can we expect from certain, like the implementation of certain states, and also what moral responsibilities should we expect the government, if it exists, to perform? What responsibilities should the citizens have? How should corporations exist in relation to, you know, even like employee-employer relationships? Should we allow them to be propagated onwards forever? Right. And I think that when we start asking these questions, I think that the moral decision that like comes out of this is, honestly, I would say, is a democratization of the workplace, and is a democratization of how we live our lives in terms of like as a workforce. Like the employee-employer relationship, I would say, is an inherently exploitative relationship. The idea of a wage, for example, like I think the Marxists and early 20th century communists, even the ones that were even anti-Leninist at that time, showed like even women's rights movements at that time were showing that like the concept of a wage, they rejected that. Like when that was being like promoted, they were saying that a wage is wrong. You are renting an individual. You are not paying them for their labor or the product of their labor. And so I would say that like the rejection of these like unjustified kind of economic distributionary methods is the primary goal of like most like many socialists. Not all socialists. Obviously, you get your tankies and your Leninists and you people who are full of shit. But like you do have the moralists who are, you know, who are socialists. And I would say, like, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to cherry pick Lenin and say, like, there are good parts of Leninism. I don't need to. Like, I don't need to look at Lenin's regimes. I don't need to look at Trotsky's regimes. I don't need to look at, you know, like, what went on in, like, all these horrible regimes in the world and go, like, oh, well, this was good, that was bad. Like, I just meant in a philosophical level. Like,
right, but I think that is a significant decision for you to make, you know, publicly and privately. I mean, I'm really just encouraging you to have a more uncompromising attitude in living out your own ethical values. I mean, I'm not really trying to change your ethical values in this conversation, but I'm pointing out to you your ethical values are in some political decisions you made, like being fundamentally pro-democracy, making that central to your view of the world. Well, that's incompatible with a lot of this shit you're compromising with.
But how is democracy incompatible with like anarchism? Like, so for example, take like the philosophy of like Noam Chomsky and like anarcho-syndicalism.
Okay.
How is democracy incompatible?
Good question. I want to reply to something you said about 3 minutes ago. Sorry, it just happened. It's okay, but we're the kind of several different topics here in several directions, which is good. It's a sign of a good conversation. But a couple minutes ago, you were talking about ethical decisions and fundamental commitment to being moral, okay? And I want to point out, you know, I'm radically open-minded and flexible about that, but there has to be a point, and you have to be honest with yourself about what is the point of making this moral compromise or even doing something you know to be evil. Apologies if you already know this about me, you may not. I signed up to join the army to fight against ISIS. It's only a couple of years ago when that war was very much hot and ongoing. So ISIS, the Islamic State, right? Now, there are all kinds of immoral elements to that, right? And just to give a really quick one, if you're vegan, in that war, you know, they had a lot of problems with sheep on the road, you know, in Afghanistan and what have you. And you shoot people, but it may sound ridiculous, you also shoot sheep in that war. It happened quite a bit. Now, if you ask me on a chalkboard, you know, like we're in a philosophy classroom in a university, is it moral or immoral to shoot a sheep? You're not even going to eat the sheep. You know what I mean? You're killing an animal just as an obstruction to traffic. You know, oh, sure. In a sense, it's immoral. Am I willing to do it? Yes, with no hesitation. I'm at war. We're trying to win this war. We're going to shoot sheep. We're going to shoot people. Like, there are all kinds of immoral and unethical things I am willing to commit to do. And I am not going to lie to myself, and I'm not going to lie to anyone else. I'm not going to lie to my girlfriend or my wife or my grandkids about what it is I did or why. But yes, I'm willing to make the commitment to do evil and unethical things for a reason that I know, right?
Just to clarify, your girlfriend and your wife are the same person, right?
Depends. I mean, if I convert to Mormonism, no, it's just my point is whether it's your girlfriend or your wife or whatever, however it works out, you know, whatever your situation may be. But look, you know, that's one of the temptations, converting to Mormonism or converting to Islam. You get more options. All right. But look, you know.
I just switch inside I'm only joking, obviously.
Look, man, I used to live in France. I used to live in Thailand. There were a lot of alternative lifestyles there. All right. Really, that's a kind of standard model for marriage in France, let alone getting into Thai culture. Look, you could commit to embracing what's bad and evil and wrong with socialism as a philosophy or anarchism as a philosophy or even communism as a philosophy if there were a point. But like I'm suggesting to you, in current circumstances in 2020, there actually isn't a point. And in some ways, like you may be doing yourself a disservice. Like you may be really limiting positively what you can do with your life by making these compromises. Now, like, you know, right now, there's a revolution going on in Thailand, okay? And it may be unsuccessful. I mean, if you were gambling on it, it's quite possible it will fizzle out and nothing's really going to change at the end of this attempted revolution.
The kings died and so on, and the unpopular prince is like coming to power, but obviously the one,
yes,
the Jura was.
Put it this way, there are fundamental questions about how democratic or not democratic Thailand is going to be in the immediate future. Okay, all kinds of people have to make the compromise. Like they don't agree with everything in the Revolutionary Party, let's say, but they say, okay, I'm going to make this compromise. I'm going to commit to joining this party to achieve this objective, and then after the revolution is over, we can debate all kinds of other things, right? People do make those commitments. But what I'm saying to you is making excuses for Lenin, like fraternizing in this way or compromising this way, playing these games with these particular ideologies. It makes no sense in Cambodia in 2020. It makes no sense in Canada in 2020. I think it makes no sense even in England or Scotland in 2020. Like even on that level of like being willing to embrace something evil for an outcome you're pursuing, I still think this is fundamentally wrong. Like I really think in 2020, so I really think 2020, just in one sentence, because you just saw that video. You know, I have many videos talking about the history of communism and socialism, hundreds or something. But you know, the one video you just saw, what I'm saying to members of Black Lives Matter, to the BLM movement, and I've made other videos talking about it that are more than 30 minutes long, greater length, is no, in 2020, the correct choice is to actually reject Marxism. Not to like play this game of trying to appropriate from Marxism or wear the cape of being a Marxist. Like, no, like actually that's the right choice to make. And I don't just mean it in a chalkboard sense. I even mean it in this pragmatic sense of being willing to do something evil for some kind of outcome.
Like, I mean, look, the way I say this, like, one, like, I wouldn't advocate anyone do anything evil necessarily anyway, because I'm not revolutionary, so I'm not arguing that people do anything that is like cruel and unusual, trying to overthrow the capitalist state, blah blah blah. Like I'm not advocating for that. Like in terms of like advocating for like a socialist like quote unquote revolution or social change, I would talk about I don't know if you're familiar with it, which is called the Long March Through the Institutions, in which we try and democratize our institutions and slowly to move towards a socialist state, and a socialist state as being defined as a state which is based around mutual cooperation for the benefit of the general population, rather than, let's say, the production of profit versus capitalism, when you talk about capitalism, right? And then, like, so when we talk about, like, you know, the moral responsibility of the individual and like what people would be or would not be willing to do, I know that like Black Lives Matter, for example, talking about the abolition of the police force, talking about killing the police, talking about doing some horrible things. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm critical of the movement myself. I'm not actually a fan of like the way it's being led or like lack of leadership even. Or the way or its overall political goals, if it even has any, because it lacks legislative like change. It has its issues, and it's certainly different to necessarily what I would say that they should be advocating for. And I do think that obviously, as you say, many of the leaders, for example, have been influenced by perhaps some of the tanky kind of, Leninist, Stalinist like regimes, and have maybe been influenced by this idea of like direct revolution, because at the end of the day, like, people like the whole communist like aesthetic, right? I mean, like the Stalinist, like, red revolution, like the Lenin red revolution, like kind of aesthetic that was deliberate propaganda in the first place. Like, it's sexy, you know what I mean? That people like,
Right.
like the revolutionary like life. It looks sexy, right? I don't want any of that. Like, my
Right.
philosophy is not so sexy, because it's actually about making the world a better place.
Right, right. So look, I know that's why, but that's part of why I've phrased this conversation the way it is that like I feel like your packaging, your wrapping, what you're doing on the surface, isn't really consonant with, doesn't make sense for who you are at your core or whatever. Like I'm not. You can tell, like, this is not me saying I hate you or something. It's saying, look, I think if you really think about it, maybe maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe the next few months or something. Probably you need to think about rebranding yourself a little bit, because if this is who you are and what you're about, I see a lot of self-contradictory compromises you're getting yourself involved with that just don't make sense for you. I also don't think they make sense for England or Cambodia or the whole world in general, but for you specifically.
Take Cambodia, right? Like, take Cambodia right now. I mean, Cambodia is an incredibly poor country within the capitalist regime. Like take like Vietnam. I mean, like, use Vietnam as an example. Vietnam is, like you said, it was a hybrid between capitalism and communism. I'd probably not say that. I'd say it was like totalitarianism and capitalism. The same with like China. I would say China's fascist. I would say that it's a totalitarian government with a capitalist economy based around like a somewhat half-planned economy around a particular group's interest, and ultimately around this nationalistic goal, like ultimately like fuck the West kind of mentality. And I would say that all of this is also happening in capitalism today. And so even if we take like your mentality, like when we're choosing to be like what we are choosing to be, and if we admit that like we kind of have at this kind of point in time this decision to be a capitalist or a communist, or a capitalist and a socialist, or whatever it may be, like the choice of being a capitalist is just as fundamentally obstructive to justice as the choice of being, let's say, even like a state communist. Because, I mean, like, have you ever heard of the Black Book of Capitalism? Like, 100 million people are supposed to have died because of, like, capitalism. And if we talk about, like, like, poverty, exploitation, the proxy wars, even the war, like, for example, in Iraq, like, the toppling of Saddam Hussein, and then the killing of the civilians there, Afghanistan, the propping up of Saddam Hussein in the first place by the American government, Libya, Syria. Like, many of these conflicts in the first place have been engineered because of corporate interests.
But what you're engaging in right now, this is what the British call whataboutism. I think the British know that phrase more than Americans do. This is whataboutism. And you are engaging in a no true Scotsman fallacy in order to justify communism. Like, now, you may not realize this, but this is what I see, and this is what other people who are moderates or pragmatists, who are neither extreme left nor extreme right, see. What you just said to me now, I know you're accustomed to it, and you've probably said this same thing with minor differences 10, 20 times in your life. What you were doing there, beginning with saying that you don't recognize the current government of China as communist, right? This is a no true Scotsman fallacy. So communism remains unstained by the historical reality of what China was or is, the historical reality of what Vietnam and Cambodia were in the past. Like, why do this? Why do this to yourself? You know?
Look at Mao. Like, Mao was a fucking disgusting person, inspired by Leninist.
Right.
Stalinist
Okay.
philosophy.
Right. But let's keep it simple. Dude. Communism. Like, is this right or is this wrong?
This is the whole point. Like, what do you define these regimes as? So, for example, socialism, and even the combination of socialism and communism, if you want to throw them together, how would you say, like, for example, an anarcho-socialist who argues for the democratization of the workplace, the democratization of the government, the removal of corporate interests and lobbying interests that are corrupting our current democracy, how would you compare them, for example, against something like the Maoist regime in China, which is
look,
ultimately like totalitarian and despotical?
I remember there was a letter sent in to Dan Savage. Dan Savage is a sex advice columnist from a guy who said that he considered himself heterosexual, he was married to a woman he wasn't attracted to, and that when he went to the gym, he would receive oral sex from other men but not have anal sex. And he was writing and saying, do you think I'm gay or straight? Okay? Now, look, you have blowjobs with men but not anal sex. How do you want to define gay? To me, this is like a complete bullshit, self-defeating. But let's. This is the important thing. My whole approach to politics. Ultimately, this is about motivation and honesty and integrity and what kind of person you want to be. Now, if a man says that to you, if a man says to you that he has oral sex with other men but doesn't consider himself gay, his motivation is what's important here, not the definition of the word gay. Like in some languages, in some cultures, maybe gay is defined so narrowly that he doesn't get gay. Doesn't matter. You can see, but let me finish. His motivation is self-justification. He's trying to justify himself and his identity, right? Who would have the motivation? Who would have the motivation to claim that Mao Zedong was not a communist? That is just ridiculous. Who would have the motivation to claim that Vietnam today or Cambodia in the 1970s was not communist? Now, I'll tell you who has that motivation. Other communists, right? Throughout the whole history of Mongolia, the communist government of Mongolia was publishing propaganda claiming that China wasn't a legitimate communist country that Mongolia was. That's who does that. Right? So I'm just saying, I know you want to point towards this more chalkboard world. How exactly do we find communism? No, all of these countries are communist. And all of these people are gay. There's more than one way to be gay. Okay? And there's more than one way to be communist. And this is communism. And who would claim it's not communism?
Look at it like this. Would you say that Norway, Switzerland, Norway or Scandinavian countries, are they socialists? They get called socialists all the time.
Right, but I think you know the answer to that question. These are hybrid economies.
Yeah, 100% not. They're capitalists, right?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. I mean, in many of those countries, for example, you can say they have a socialist university system and a socialist healthcare system. So those are significant parts of the economy that are socialist.
A liberalist fuck system based around the tax reimbursement of tax redistribution of wealth, based high tax system, drawing as much money into the government.
Right. But look, I tell you, you don't do economics, but yeah, that's socialism. I mean, by definition, you draw a line in the economy, and some things are socialized and some are not. So in some countries, really quick example, in some countries, the generation of electricity is socialist. You say there are no private companies involved. The government directly takes tax dollars. So no, but that is textbook definition of what's socialism and what's not. So a country like Denmark is a hybrid economy. The United States also is a hybrid economy, but they draw the line of how much is free market and how much is socialist at a different point in different ways.
The point, drawing lines is a fundamental point, and it talks about definition. If you're saying where does capitalism and socialism begin and end, then we've got an issue, and that's kind of the point I was trying to say. I would say that if we are drawing lines, it's at what point is the guy gay? You know what I mean? Am I holding hands with the guy? Is that gay? Is it are traps gay? You know what I mean?
Right. Okay, but this is good. This brings back. But the point is, what I'm questioning is not where you draw the line. It's fine. You're asking the question. It's a legitimate question. What I'm asking is, what is your motivation to claim this? If you say you only suck dick a couple times a month, you don't think you're gay, right?
Wait a minute, just to clarify to my chat, I am not saying
extremely erudite, hypothetical, academic conversation here. But if you were to say that you only suck dick a couple times a month and you still think you're straight, what's really important to address is your motivation in making the claim. It's not really the plausibility of the claim or where you draw the line.
Look at the motivation to reject a certain identity is based upon the
right.
Of that identity and the way it's performed.
But you still want to assert, right? In this hypothetical example, you still want to assert you're heterosexual, right? You still want to assert you're heterosexual even though you have gay sex in this hypothetical. So that's the significance of it in terms of motivation. But this is my point. So this brings back who would claim, and you did earlier, and I think this points to this deep fissure within what you're doing philosophically and politically that you need to, I suggest, I'm not saying this to insult you, but I suggest in the next weeks or months, you really think about it and try to make this coherent instead of incoherent. Who would say to me or anyone, who would make the claim that Mao Zedong was not communist? Or that communist China was, that's ridiculous. Who would say that Vietnam or Laos are not communist? Of course they're communist. That's just ridiculous.
Look at it like this. What are you defining communism as? It's like when you talk about that guy sucking dick and then not saying that he's not gay. It's because that sucking dick is gay, right? Like it is a sexual act where two men are participating in sexual act together. That is overtly homosexual, right? But like when we talk about China, what is overtly communist about China? All that we have is the totalitarian state.
I'm not saying this from social, but I don't know if you've read one book about the history of China. Yes, China is overtly communist. So I used to work at a university, okay? The university was controlled by a Communist Party secretariat. I have a photograph of myself standing in front of the door, and there's a hammer and sickle logo. The government of China today, even down to the level of particular hospitals and particular universities, like on that small scale of management, it is ruled by a Communist Party. Everyone in that Communist Party studies the philosophy of Marx, Lenin, Mao Zedong, a list of communists. They write exams proving that they've done the reading and understand the philosophy. It is ruled by communists. It is overtly, ostentatiously communist. They sing communist. Sorry, but please, if you ask the question, because you did ask the question, what is overtly communist about China? They literally have parades where the army marches and they sing communist songs in unison, and that's the government doing that. So if you're asking, what is overtly communist? I'm saying, what are you, blind? Like, this is way more absurd. This is way more absurd than the homosexuality question.
I understand what you're saying, but like, look at it like this. It's like, for example, Stalinists aren't Leninists, right? We can agree that like there's a distinction between. I'm assuming we can agree that there's a distinction between Stalinism and Leninism in terms of like how the state would have been run, which is why Stalin assassinated Trotsky, right? Like because he didn't. Want
right. But there's a difference. There's a difference between oral sex and anal sex too, right? There's a difference between oral sex and anal sex.
Would parade Lenin everywhere, and then they had a minister, particularly I can't remember his name, that would use Lenin's like quotes of Lenin to justify whatever like Stalin or the USSR were doing.
But why are we even getting into these details? We know they're both communist. Stalinism is a form of communism. Leninism is a form of communism. It's not debated.
It's not about them being communist. I agree that both communist. But the point is that they are not the same. Yet Stalinism used Leninism as an aesthetic to masquerade its actual political endeavors.
I know, but this is real whataboutism. At no point have I been arguing that Stalinism and Leninism are the same. Like, this is, like, that's not part of my argument.
No, I'm just giving a comparative example. Like, so for example, right, like, the way that China works today, in terms of economics, has no economic ties to Marxism. If you look at the way that workers are treated, and the way that workers' rights are enforced, or the idea of the dictate of the proletariat, the alienation of the worker is far more severe in China than it is in many other capitalist countries. The whole point is that China does not abide by what would be the economic the economic dictates of Marxism. It doesn't at all, not at all, not even a little bit. And all it has is a totalitarian state. So like, why would you like? So like, what I'm saying is like with China, I understand why you say like obviously that communist maybe in ideology, right? Just as that guy who is sucking dick is straight in his mind. Like China is straight. They are communist in their minds, but in action they are capitalists. They do not actually reflect any of the actions that would be representative of a Marxist.
Okay, right, but your choice today is if you're pro-communist or anti-communist, if you're going to make excuses for this or engage in cherry picking or not. And this is what I'm saying, because I think I know your answer. So if I ask you today, so given everything you've just said about China, given the current situation in China 2020, do you think China would be better or worse if they had elections, let's say the exact same system of elections that they have right now in Switzerland? So elections and direct democracy, and people can propose amendments to the Constitution and have a referendum. Let's just say they copied and pasted the Swiss Constitution into the Chinese Constitution. If they had democracy instead of communism in that sense, instead of being ruled by a communist dictatorship that, as you have pointed out correctly, rules over an economy that's like 90% capitalist or something. What exactly the percent? Maybe some people would say it's 70%, some people would say it's 95%. Because again, you have to count in things like hospitals and universities. There are parts of the economy in China that are still more communist than you think, in the military and what have you. But in any case, it is a predominantly capitalist society ruled over by communist dictatorship. But you now in 2020, do you think it would be an improvement to replace that communist part of the system with the democratic part of the system.
Oh, absolutely, a democratic
Right. So you've got to live that accordingly, bro. Like, that's all I'm saying is you have to start living your life and package yourself with philosophy as someone who is anti-communist in that sense, because that's all it takes.
But that's not socialism. They don't get to own that, man. It's like that they don't get to own what is you don't have to be like, if you're a socialist, you have to go like
But
China.
these are real world palpable examples. Right now, the government of Nepal is communist. Now, right away, I mean, like I said before, there's a difference between oral sex and anal sex, but it's all sex, right? If right now, if we make a comparison, so just real quickly, if you make a comparison right now, if you make a comparison between the government of Nepal and the government of Vietnam, just to pick two examples, and say in what ways are these two places communist, it's very different. You're going to come up with a long list of really meaningful differences, right? But still, if I were to ask you the question, do you think the way forward for Nepal in the next 20 years, do you want Nepal to become more like China today? Or do you want Nepal to become more like Switzerland? Your answer, your honest, true answer is that you want Nepal to be more like Switzerland. And on some level, you know it. You're just not living accordingly.
No. But even if you take that example, where the next society is going to develop. Do I want for example, Nepal to be more like Switzerland rather, or China? Well, you've basically propped up, for example, perhaps one of the most moral states in the world versus one of the least moral states in the world.
Right. So why don't you start, if you believe that, start living that identity. If you think that Switzerland is one of the most moral states in the world, that should be who you describe yourself. You're not even a socialist anymore. Now you're a Swissist. What can I tell you? You're a Helvetianist. You're a Helvetian Republicist. You have to start living that way, man. Go on. But I mean, it'd be like if you met someone who was in denial about being vegan. If I met someone who doesn't describe themselves as vegan, but they live a vegan diet and they think leather is immoral, I'd say, look, you got to start calling yourself vegan. Start living accordingly.
For example, when you were talking about, for example, what I admire from Scandinavia, you said that they are socialist aspects of the economy. When I'm talking about the things I admire from Scandinavia, they would be what you describe as those socialist aspects of the economy, right? It's just when we talk about and if you genuinely believe that that's a form of socialism and it's a mixed hybrid economy, then how can we deny that, for example, the World Happiness Reports of these hybrid economies between socialism and capitalism is not if socialism is this degradation towards our identities, towards the way that we live in a moral framework, then why are Scandinavia such moral paragons compared to somewhere like the United States, which is by far more right-leaning and more traditionally capitalist? And that's what I would say. It's would you want Nepal to be more like, for example, Scandinavia, or would you want it to be more like the United States?
Yeah, right. So just mention, I'm writing a book right now, which makes my political views more clear. And you might enjoy it. At various reasons, various points in this, I thought, gee, this guy might be interested in looking at my book. The book isn't finished yet. I'm doing the final rewrites and revisions and writing the concluding chapter now. So probably within a week or something, I'm going to be finished this book, and I'm sharing it as a PDF on Patreon. But this conversation is only in small part about me. But I don't know how many of my videos you've seen about socialism. But my perspective on socialism is not that socialism should be abolished. I take the pragmatic view that at all times, some portion of the economy is socialist and some portion is free market or capitalist. And so obviously, the percentage of the economy that is socialist in Denmark is much higher than it is in the United States of America. And, with a country like Canada, I think Canada is a very, very poor quality and system of government. Obviously, Switzerland is a more positive example for Canada to look at in many ways. But, I just say, so I assume you're in your early 20s now?
Late 20s.
Okay, so I'm 42. So look, I'm 42. I just say I think it's a hard thing, but my perspective on you is not that you're a bad person, is not that you have bad intentions. My perspective on you is that you're someone who's become too accustomed to the chalkboard academic world. And I know you're rebelling against it to some extent too. You were just saying what complete bullshit the university system is and university philosophy is now. His point is, but in the real world, these are the kinds of hard, pragmatic decisions we have to make. Now, I'm interested in Nepal. It's very unlikely I'm now going to move to Nepal and make Nepal my next Cambodia, but I'm tempted. It's a possibility in my mind. It's because also the language there is very easy to learn. Compared to Cambodian, believe me, you and I could both learn an indigenous Nepalese language in 3 months. Compared to Chinese, easy language. But look, Nepal is interesting to me politically. It would be so hard for me to move to Nepal and advocate for a more democratic future in a context that is dominated on the one hand by communism and on the other hand by Hindu nationalism that is attached to the monarchy, like pro-monarchist, Hindu casteist. That's a really tough political environment for me to be in, and it would probably entail really difficult pragmatic sacrifices. It might be that the only colleagues I have would be people who are members of the Communist Party. And that would be very disturbing for me to deal with. Like, who am I going to even eat lunch with and talk about politics with? Well, on the one hand, there are these Hindus, Hindu nationalists, and on the other hand, there are the communists, and there are only a couple fragments of people who aren't signed up with one of these groups to fight over the future of Nepal. That's the real world. That's really tough, right? And it involves those kinds of compromises. You know, I was living in Taiwan, very different kind of, like in Taiwan, they don't have a left to right political spectrum, right? As you know, so it's in different countries, in different contexts, these choices. But when you make those questions, the primary questions in your life, not abstract questions of how do you define socialism on a chalkboard, right? But the question is, who am I? What kind of person am I going to become? How am I going to live my life? What is the difference in the real world I can make that I want to make? And then I'm going to live accordingly. Right, and then I'm going to live accordingly. That's going to shape you and lead to a very different life from what you've been doing.
That's the thing. Like, I think the person that I want to be in life, and the person that I would campaign that we should be in life, is a person that supports worker movements, unionization. I would say that I'm a person that would support, the development of workers' rights in like that we see today within the current states that we have. I would be a person that would support the continued democratization of our political systems and a removal of this first past the post military. I'm the kind of person that would advocate away from this mindless consumerism that engulfs the capitalist hedonistic mildew that we live in, and move towards an ethical consumerism that exists in something like veganism. Like, these are the kind of real life changes that I would say that individuals can and should make in their lives. And I would attribute most of those changes in relation to the bedrock of equality. And I would argue that the foundations of many socialist movements is this foundation of equality, this idea of rejection of a master-slave relationship between individuals and the propagation of a cooperation between individuals. And that's what I would say.
Okay, so I'm not going to question any of that. I'm not going to question that. On some level, I'm wondering if you've actually spent time with labor union organization with the reality of that side of politics.
Well, for example, my granddad was a unionist. He was a unionist, and many. Okay, yeah, there was corruption, and like, don't get me wrong, there was corruption in labor unions.
Right. I think if you start getting involved in that, you might very quickly become disillusioned and realize that's a complete waste of your time. But, I'm not leaving that aside. I'm not questioning your commitment to labor unions. But given what you've just set out, you set out a series of changes you want to make in the world, differences you want to make in the world, okay? What I'm saying to you is, you may not realize how much it discredits you and makes you into a joke and a loathsome person when you say things that sound like or actually are excuses for Lenin, excuses for Stalin and Mao Zedong. And you have been living in an academic context where that's kind of glad-handled, it's either ignored or encouraged. When you say things like, well, you define socialism in this way, and therefore China and Vietnam don't count as socialist, and were never really communist, and they don't discredit the fine ideals that you've attributed to Lenin and so on, dude, you are making yourself into a crackpot. And people aren't going to tell you that. You are discrediting yourself. You are disabling your ability to make a positive difference in the world. And part of the reason is that you then can't have those pragmatic conversations with people who may also want to have a society that's more like Switzerland or more like Denmark, right? And who don't want to have a society like Mao Zedong's dictatorship,
But here's the thing. What do you think communism is in the first place? Because I say you say you don't want to argue about definitions and stuff.
Dude, that's like, look, fine. I've made a lot of YouTube videos with that. But look, can I just point out to you, I'm asking the question of who do you want to be? Okay, I'm asking the question, who do you want to be and how do you want to live? And you're answering back, how do you define communism? Like, don't you realize what a crutch this has become for you? Don't you realize what an excuse this is? Dude, real world, Mao Zedong was communist. There's nothing you can say to me in this conversation.
Mao Zedong's communist. He's not the only one.
Right, but dude, that's why pull this back to an academic parlor debate on a chalkboard about how exactly you define communism. We're not going to get into a debate about exactly how do you define homosexuality either, right? There's no point. Like, You are disclosing your motivation of getting involved with this.
For example, no, but the whole point, so for example, the whole R-Trap's-gay kind of debate that was going on in the online communities, this idea this is kind of okay, well, if it's a girl and she has a dick, does that make it gay if I have a sexual relation with her? There are obviously there are nuances within even aspects of identity in ideological frameworks, and that's kind of the point. The whole thing is when we talk about how you define communism, so far from what I've got from your argument is you just define communism as totalitarianism. Where is the economics of the communist regime? Tell me what you think economically socialism and communists stand for.
Yeah, okay. Why? In what way is that a relevant answer to the point I'm raising? Because for me, this is about who you are and what moral compromise is going to make. What economic definition of communism would diminish or distract from the fact that you are willing to positively identify with this? That's the point here. We can get into what it was Lenin was trying to accomplish with the dictatorship of the proletariat.
I identify with those individuals who existed in Catalonia in the 1930s who were fighting the fascists and trying to take back control over their lives while being sabotaged by the communists and the capitalists who exist in that period.
Totally. So good new direction. So right now you're in your late 20s. Do you think it's possible that when you are in your late 50s, you'll look back on that and laugh? You'll think, wow, what a stupid, pointless, youthful delusion it was for me to think that I could build my academic career or my political career or change the world by glamorizing this period of 5 years in the history of Catalonia, Spain, and holding that up as an ideal for the future of England. Do you think an older person could look at that and kind of sneer? Is that imaginable to you?
Of course they could, but then you've got people who are elderly, for example, Noam Chomsky, who's in his
Right. So Noam Chomsky, did he change the world? Compare Noam Chomsky to Bernie Sanders even.
Noam Chomsky's had an incredible impact on the world.
Okay, I completely disagree. I look at Noam Chomsky as a total failure. And Noam Chomsky supported the Khmer Rouge. He supported the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. He published on it. He backed it up for years, decades. I look at Noam Chomsky as a guy who completely discredited himself. His political career is a complete failure. And he had the potential. He had the fame on the basis of his status. He had fame and wealth, being a professor of linguistics who got famous in that field in his own right, even though I think his work on linguistics is also complete horseshit. But, Noam Chomsky began from a position of power, privilege, and influence much greater than someone like Bernie Sanders. But he wasn't willing to make the compromises and deal with the real world in a way that would actually get outcomes.
Obviously, politicians have a lot greater influence. Although Bernie Sanders, what the fuck's he done?
Right. And I also have videos criticizing Bernie Sanders because he wasn't willing to make the compromises.
Bernie Sanders hasn't done anything, man, because the whole political system in the United States is based around economic lobbying, which ultimately
No, it's Bernie Sanders' own fault. Here's what. Look, very simple. Obviously, I can talk about Bernie Sanders for an hour. You know what fucked up Bernie Sanders' life? You know what destroyed Bernie Sanders' whole life? Was that he wouldn't let go of this word socialism. He kept on calling himself a socialist even when it was completely absurd. I think in his early career he probably was a socialist, but after a certain point you have to define the term socialist way more broadly than homosexuality to call Bernie Sanders a socialist. But he insisted on hanging his hat on that peg. He insisted on defining himself that way. And it completely discredited his political career, and that's why he accomplished nothing. Or he accomplished 1/10 of what he could have accomplished. He could have been president of the United States of America, but he wasn't because of socialism, because of his attachment to that ideology.
Sold out all of the values which would have made him a good president. Let's be honest, who becomes president of the United States of America? Those people who don't have ethics. That's kind of the point. The whole point of who wins elections is based upon who can generate the most money behind your commitment. Joe Biden had more money than Trump, so Joe Biden won.
You're into whataboutism in a big way, man. Look, your commitment ultimately is not to any definition of the word socialist or an economic definition of the word communist or a definition of what happened with the anarchist party in Catalonia for a period of 5 years, during which time they were all heavily armed and in a state of civil war. It's ridiculous to point to this as utopia. Okay,
and the communists undermined.
Okay, look. I get it. I know the history of anarchism in Catalonia. Okay? I know, but come on, it's not utopia. Look, I gotta finish this sentence, bro. Look, your commitment is not to a definition of socialism, and it's not to a definition of anarchism. Your commitment is to you, okay? Ultimately, Bernie Sanders has to be committed to being Bernie Sanders, and you have to be committed to being you. And all this other horseshit, dude, it's really holding you back. You're pinned down by chalkboard definitions that just discredit you.
Even if we agreed that we are ultimately committed to being ourselves, it's like, who do we choose to be? And who we choose to be
Right.
is representative of values and understanding of...
But that's the first question I open with. What I want to talk to you about. It's exactly about who you choose to be.
Like, and this is the whole point. Like the point of being a socialist in the first place, and any decent, like someone accusing someone like, so for example, of like Richard Wolff or Noam Chomsky or the anarchists in Catalonia of being similar to those individuals. For example, the anarchists were fighting those individuals you are comparing them against. Like not actually like physically fighting them, but economically fighting them, being undermined by the communist parties. The control and authority, which were basically bankrupting the worker-owned industries in that place, essentially was done by the communists that you are comparing the anarchists against, these other kind of socialists, and even was it like George Orwell describing Catalonia as like a true era of socialism was the whole point. It's just like, if that is a true era of socialism, then what is the comparative?
Dude, if you listen to this,
it isn't the same thing, and it cannot be the same thing. It's like saying that
if you listen to this recording back, I think you've got to recognize you're speaking out of the extent to which you've just been locked in academia for so long. This is real academic shit you're saying back to me. If you go around telling people in politics, on YouTube, just in your personal life, if you go around telling people that you are an anarchist in the same sense that Noam Chomsky is an anarchist, that discredits you. Okay? If you go around telling people that you are a socialist who sees positive things in the ideals of Lenin, although not in his execution, blah, 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 and you don't recognize communist China as communist because you have this idealized definition of communism that you're attached to, that discredits you. And it discredits you not just in the eyes of 90% of people or 95% of people. It discredits you in the eyes of 100% of people who really matter. And I completely sympathize that living inside a PhD program, you're in a PhD program of philosophy, I realize that you can't see that. I realize you're blind to the extent to which you make yourself a laughingstock by identifying with and making excuses for those ideologies. A Noam Chomsky school of thought anarchist. Who is derided more? Who is more contemptible or laughable in the political spectrum than the tiny coven of Noam Chomsky worshipping left-wing anarchists who want to trade stories about their really great excuses for supporting the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and supporting Hamas in Israel? Okay, that's who those people are. They're pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian nutcases. I mean, this is the fucking reality of politics. Dude, I don't have to. Dude, I'm telling you, I'm a pragmatist. But look, my position in this conversation is to say to you,
for example, my granddad was in the Palestine police. You know what I mean? So, for example, as a UN peacekeeper in that state, and he faced terrorism from what was the Jewish Women's Army and many of the terrorist organizations at that time. Facing bombs going off in the Hotel Alexandria, and people small children being blown up around them, people being killed, around them.
What do you think you're doing right now? You think you're getting the moral high ground by raising these irrelevant anecdotes? What's the point?
Well, no, the point of the matter is that when we talk about the horrors of Palestine and defending the people of Palestine, we can't defend the people and condemn Hamas.
No, you have to decide what kind of person you're going to be. That's all you get to control is your little life. Right? You don't get to change. That's also, why I support veganism. I'm talking about making the difference you can make in the world. There isn't a goddamn thing you can do about the civil war in Syria. There isn't a goddamn thing you can do about the Palestinian peace process. Not a goddamn thing. You get to decide what kind of person you're going to be. And that's what I'm saying to you. You know what really matters for you? I think...
we talk about the economics of our systems, man. The fact that we can have an influence on the economics of our system by, modifying the ways in which the workers are involved in corporations, then we can have a real political influence. I mean, one of the things I was talking about recently.
Okay, you think so? Okay, you think so? You're making the claim. You're making the wait a minute. Hold on, college boy. You're making the claim that you, with your PhD in philosophy, are going to be the leader of a trade labor union, and you're going to influence them with your ideals from Noam Chomsky and from Catalonian anarchism. That's your fucking claim in 2020. We can do another interview in 2025 and look back at what you accomplished in those 5 years. You are claiming real world, this is not academic writing on a chalkboard, that you personally are going to become a labor union organizer with your bullshit ideology and your excuses for Leninism and all this other shit. Have you even thought through the sacrifices you'd have to make as a person to be in that position of leadership? Yeah, but dude, I know, but you did the opposite also. That's what I'm drawing your attention to, is that you're making these self-contradictory compromises and waffling. Dude, think about, so I don't know if you've known any of those guys who are real labor union organizers. They have to go through this incredibly boring process of getting a degree in law related to labor union laws. They have to spend years working inside that union. They have to spend their whole life surrounded by the blue-collar schlubs in that union. And then guess what? All they get to fucking advocate for is higher wages and longer vacations and jack shit else. And then they get to look back. They get to look back at the 40 years they spent doing that and say, hey, I got people a $2 an hour raise and a slightly longer vacation. That's what they spent their lives accomplishing. And you will never be able to. Those people will hate you and laugh at you and sneer at you, college boy, with your PhD in philosophy and your laughable talk about Noam Chomsky and anarchism. Like, you don't realize the extent to which, like, if you think you're discredited in my eyes, think about how discredited you are in the eyes of a pipe fitter. You think those people are impressed with your ideology? This is a joke, man.
Like, what are you talking about, man? Like, look at it like this, right? Like, you say that we'll have to make real-world decisions about our ethics. Yeah, you've ended this conversation. You must have insulted me like at least fucking 10 times.
Oh, well,
like,
I can apologize. I'm sorry you feel insulted. I mean, I was trying to give a compelling and engaging performance for you, but anyway, sorry.
Fair enough. That's fair enough. Like, I understand. Like, things get heated. Like, whatever. Like, I get it, and I understand. Like, you have your position. I have mine, and like these boundaries. Like, maybe like being the tongue in cheek is good anyway, because at least you're talking straight. But like, the thing is that I would say that, like, don't get me wrong. I understand. Like, having real world impact is perhaps one of the most difficult things ever, right? Like, in general, right? Like, just having like the ability to change the way things are in the world. But I don't think that means that we should just give up, right? I mean, that's the whole point of veganism, isn't it? Like, the fact that we will campaign, even though things at the minute or at the darkest night they could possibly be, we have to see the stars in the words of Martin Luther King. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, this atrocity that is happening to animals every single fucking day is so fucking atrocious that we would outright do anything to stop it, because it is disgusting. It's so horrific. And it's the same thing with like the way that I'm approaching, like, the things like socialism and so on, and the way that the exploitation of the working class, the exploitation of other the indigenous peoples in various countries and so on. Like, these things are things that I care about, and whether I can do make a massive political shift versus like actually try and make a difference is how I'm approaching my life, and that's the ethic that I'm trying to do performatively in my life.
I understand, so but I'm listening to your justification of your own politics. Like,
for example, I was going to say like politics. I was just going to say like make a real life political kind of analogy. Like right now we have Brexit coming up in Britain, right? Like Britain's leaving the EU, and it's going to make a big difference towards animal agriculture and agricultural laws in terms of animal agricultural subsidies, right? Subsidies are going to change.
Come on, this is off topic. Come on, Brexit is off topic. Come on, this is getting off topic.
No, the reason it's not off topic is because of this, like because it gives vegans an opportunity to attack farm subsidies for the first time, in terms of like educating the population, and also by attempting to change things politically in certain directions in order to minimize farm subsidies, which ultimately prop up, many agricultural businesses. I'm sure you're aware of that as a vegan. Like it's one of the big things that we're trying to fight against. And suddenly we may have an opportunity to do that. And being an individual who has moral convictions, who has ethical convictions, like having those convictions is waiting for an opportunity to express what is right in your day-to-day life, even if you cannot do it at that moment. Would you not agree?
What you and I agree about is having a focus on the difference you can actually make in your own life. And it comes out with different phrasings and different wordings, right? But what I'm challenging you with is that I really think that what you're doing and how you're living, philosophically, politically, and every other way, is actually incompatible with that philosophy and with many aspects of the not even the philosophy, but of the pragmatic political conclusions you've come to.
But I just want to.
So look, it's fine. You raised this issue of Brexit, but the example we were talking about before, which just based on how you state your own political philosophy and how you justify your own identity, it seemed to be a big deal to you. You were talking about labor union organization. Now, I'm not painting you into a corner. I didn't like corner you and force you to say something about labor unionism. It seems to me that authentically and sincerely, that's a large part of how you justify your engagement with socialism and a particular school of anarchism and the extent to which you flirt with the far left beyond that. So that's coherent. Like, I understand what you're saying. But if you told me, based on your current situation, getting a PhD in England in philosophy, et cetera, and I'm sorry if you thought I was being insulting, but I'm trying to make you aware of how you would be perceived as a vegan with a PhD in philosophy if you're getting involved with labor union activism. Like, I don't know, and this is your ideology, and you're talking about Noam Chomsky and the fucking Catalonian Civil War. Like, like, that's laughable within labor union activism. Like, it's just, they don't want to fuck with you. They want to deal with professional lawyers who are going to get them a $2 an hour raise and longer vacations. That's what's going on in labor union. Like, I wasn't saying it to insult you. It's to make you aware of what this path is, because it's not even a path you're on. It's a path you're thinking about or fantasizing about that justifies what you're currently doing. But look, if you said to me in this conversation that the difference you want to make is in the politics of Thailand, given what's currently unfolding, I would say to you, okay, interesting. Like, this is a narrow road that you're getting on, but you can get on, and I would talk to you, okay, you can, starting from your current position, within the next 5 years, you could become, like, I'm being honest with you could become the single most famous English language commentator on and journalist dealing with politics of Thailand in the next 5 years. Totally attainable. And you could become an influential voice, both in the East and the West. Yeah, no, but I'm being honest with you. Like, I'm not saying that you're some idiot who can't accomplish anything in life. Like, I really think that's one example of something you could do. Now, but my point is specifically talking about labor union activism within the United Kingdom from the perspective of an anarchist, anarcho-socialist, as you define yourself. I look at that and say, dude, that is a road that is leading nowhere. Now, you mentioned really briefly indigenous peoples' rights and movement. So I don't know if you know this or your audience knows this. I have a playlist, like 100 videos long, talking about my own past involvement with that, specifically the Cree and Ojibwe. Those are indigenous peoples in Canada. Took up a couple years of my life. It's something I care about and I know about. If that was what you were saying to me, I could say, okay, well, yes, that's a difficult road, but it's a road you can get on, and there is actually money involved. You can earn enough money to earn a good living, and you could have this kind of impact, but not that kind of impact. Like, we could talk. If you were even telling me that what you want to do is devote your life politically to dealing with the drug addiction problem, there are so many possible issues where I could say, yeah, you know what, there's a road ahead there. Oh, okay, and I could even see how your own political philosophy and choices would then fit into that road. And there might be positive, there might be, negative things. Like, there might be some warnings or strategic things. But I'm just saying, it's not some kind of generalized attack on your character or a generalized attack on political activism. What I was saying here was really specifically about your political identity, your political praxis, as you presented it to me, given your political philosophy. And dude, life is long. I had a period of my life where I publicly identified as a Buddhist and a scholar of Buddhism. And now I don't. And people treat you differently and people talk to you differently, and you meet and talk to different people because you're going around saying you're a Buddhist. And when you go around saying you're a vegan activist, some people just don't talk to you at all who otherwise would have talked to you, and you meet other people. These are choices we make on that human scale. But I think you really, so I assume at some point, either past, present, or future, I assume at some point you've had a debate with a right wing, like a neo-Nazi right winger, like someone who's way out on the alt-right. And sometimes they will just ask you questions. They will just ask you questions about the history of the Roman Empire or the history of Judaism. And even if they've just stated as a question, you know right away what this guy has been reading and who he's been affiliated with politically. You're like, whoa. And I'll just mention really quickly, that even happens within Buddhism. There are neo-Nazis who are Buddhists, believe it or not. And they'll say something right away. They'll say, this is a really obvious example. Some of them are more subtle. But they'll say something about the Buddha having had blonde hair and blue eyes and being a member of a certain race that begins with the letter A. But some is that obvious, some is more subtle. And you can tell right away, oh, this is where this guy comes from. I'm not saying it in a character assassination way when I say to you, look, you don't realize how much you're discrediting yourself by approaching these issues in this way, as opposed to, and I'm trying to give you a positive example, you can talk about communism in an open-minded and accepting and pragmatic way, but where you're not, presenting a kind of excuse or rationalization, whether it's for Lenin or for Vietnam or for China. And, we're sure there's some awareness of the wiggle room. oral sex is not the same as anal sex. Communism today in Nepal is not the same as communism in Laos or Vietnam. And communism in China today is very different than communism in China in the 1960s. Of course. Of course.
I think that the thing, what I would say
But you can keep your integrity as someone who's fundamentally pro-democracy. Because I read you as someone who's fundamentally pro-democracy, but you're not really living that way.
Well, you see, I think I am. Like, I would say that actually fundamentally democracy is, and even like classic liberalist values in terms of like John Locke and Enlightenment values are given their like full fruition. I would argue in like the worker-owned democracy that exists within like market socialism. That's kind of like what I would say. And I would say like when we talk about like comparison, I used to like anal sex versus like oral sex in terms of like I would say that we're not even talking about like the same species and the same like kind of reproductive mechanism if we compare something like the anarchists in Catalonia to Chairman Mao or to like Stalin. Like they're not even like they're not on the same board.
Oh, okay. So let me reply. Good point. Good point.
I do appreciate this. I do appreciate that you're saying like people will approach you depending upon the labels you decide to associate yourself with in such a way as
okay, good. Thank you for saying that. Because again, I'm not trying to insult you when I say that, but when I say like, look, outside of academia, like if you were actually trying to get involved with labor union activism, and this is how you present yourself, and this is how you talk about your ideology, those people will judge you way more harshly than I will. You will be a laughing stock as a college boy with a PhD who talks about Noam Chomsky.
That's how I will, and I may have to take that in me stride, but I think I'm a laughing stock to many people who are just being a vegan. But at the end of the day, the use of words cannot be ideologically regulated by those individuals who would take and seize control power in order to propagate their ethics and their morality above another individual's, despite not having been able to give a justification for it. And that's why we call ourselves vegans in the first place, is it not? Okay,
so you just made an interesting statement, and I would say the exact opposite. So you just said the meanings of words can't be used by people in authority to, in brief, oppress us or discriminate against us. Is that?
Oh, no, that's not what I said. I said they can be.
They can be. No, that would be what I'd say. I would say they can be. That's right.
Yeah, I would completely agree. What I'm saying is that the words that are attributable to us, we cannot allow individuals to take control of our language and our ability to identify.
Okay. So that's right. So that's where I disagree, because then pragmatically, no, of course you can. If I call people gay, if I say I'm gay, people are going to think I'm gay. It's as simple as that, right? If you say you're a socialist, people are going to start. Of course, that's life on Earth, man. Of course they can.
Look at it like it's like when you say, like, for example, you call yourself gay, people think you're gay, right? But like even like in the 1930s, the word gay meant something different.
I know, completely true. And what communism meant something different in the 1930s too. Agreed. Yeah. But that's life on Earth. No, I mean, so people can use words to judge you, and you are using words to define yourself, and you're using words to talk about how you feel and what you believe. Sure.
Actively, how we use words and how we understand words is a performative game in which we operate within other individuals. And so if I'm scared to use certain terminology because of other people's judgment, then we aren't going to be able to have a discourse beyond anything from what a certain group of individuals dictate. Like what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. Please tell me what I am and what I'm scared to be. Because otherwise I'm not going to be able to be anything that might be worth being. I wouldn't be a vegan right now if I was scared of social ridicule. But the point of the matter is I would argue that veganism is the moral position. It is the thing that we should be doing, and I'm not scared to call myself vegan because we should be doing it, and I'm trying to actively change that stigma by being willing to identify with it and act accordingly.
Point taken. But you don't want to call yourself a communist, correct? You understand the danger in that. I mean, I think you contradict yourself because you recognize that.
It's the same thing.
Yeah, but you wouldn't call yourself a Maoist, correct? I mean, just yes or no. Would you call yourself a Maoist?
You know what I mean?
Okay, but look, would you call yourself a Maoist? No. Would you call yourself a Stalinist? No. So it's the same game. You can pretend you're not playing the game, but you are. And that's why you identify with this weird form of anarchism. Now, look, I just want to say, you made a statement earlier that you think we're not comparing like dogs and cats, or we're not comparing two different types of dogs. We're comparing two completely different species when you talk about this particular form of anarchism you admire as opposed to other forms of anarchism, other forms of communism, other forms of... Okay. Okay.
haven't really
Okay,
seen
okay, wait. I gotta reply. I gotta speak to that. And this relates directly to what you just said now about how you describe yourself, how you live with your life as a political animal. Okay. I'm gonna tell you something right now that the anarchists in Catalonia had in common with Lenin and with Mao Zedong.
what was that?
They had guns and they killed everyone who disagreed with them. And wait a minute. They didn't have elections. It wasn't based on democracy. It was not, right?
Yeah, they never really got that far. I mean, if we look at the time period, they never even had political control over that area.
I know all the excuses. There are a whole lot of people on the internet who are going to make excuses for you. I'm pointing out to you, if your position now is that Switzerland is a good thing and would be an improvement, right? It's not really compatible with the game you're playing.
No, but I think, don't get me wrong, I don't think Switzerland's the end goal, do I?
Right.
I don't think that the end goal of I don't think any of the states that we see today are the end goal of what humanity's capable of. I don't know about you, but man, I'll watch Star Trek. And I see something like that, for example, idealistic as it is, as being in reach. I think there's the episode of Star Trek. I think it's one of the first episodes, right, where Q. I don't know. Do you like Star Trek? Do you know Star Trek?
I watched when I was a child, 11, 12, 13, I think, around there.
Right. So the next generation, Star Trek: The Next Generation, Patrick Stewart, very brilliant, absolutely class. In that, Patrick Stewart is presented by this omnipotent being who's trying to judge humanity for all of its wrongdoing, right? And he turns around and he says, "What Hamlet said in irony, I say."
I know the episode and I know the monologue. Yes, the monologue between Patrick Stewart and Q, the godlike figure Q. Yes.
Yeah, it's brilliant monologue because it's basically Shakespeare, and basically what he says is that humanity is capable of becoming something better than it currently is. And there's a quote from Hegel which actually represents that man by nature is not what he should be. And that's what I'm saying, that the political environment in which we see is today.
And my response to this is actually more anarchist than yours and more Max Stirner and more nihilist. And my answer to that is, what are you going to do in the next 5 years? All this stuff you've got written on the chalkboard, this whole world of academic abstractions, and then there's the question of, what do you actually do the next 5 years? Okay, I got to call it a day there. It's been great talking to you. It's our first time speaking. One hell of a conversation, one hell of a podcast. I hope that the people in the audience enjoyed it. It's 12:24 on the west coast of Canada. It's this completely spontaneous, unplanned interaction. Good to hear from you. And I hope you do accomplish a lot in the next 5 years. Because let me tell you something.
Good luck learning, was it the native language of Nepal?
Well, I am studying languages right now, but not Nepalese. But I know you've been on YouTube. You've been on YouTube since 2015, right? So you've been aware of my channel. I'm not saying you watched every video or something. You've been aware of my channel probably. You've probably been aware of my channel for 5 years or maybe even 7 years or something. I just say you've been aware of it not for just a month. I used to ask people every day, asking other vegans, vegan activists, and other people, I would ask them, what are you planning to do in the next 5 years? And 5 years later, none of them had accomplished anything, and most of those YouTube channels are shut down and gone. Some of them got pregnant and had kids. But let me tell you, if you just step away from the chalkboard and really think about you as one person with 2 hands and 2 feet and about 5 years ahead of you, it gets scary in a different way. It gets dangerous in a different way. And I think you will see these ideological and abstract decisions you're making in a very different way in terms of that human scale.